We'll just give everybody a few minutes to join. Just put a slide up there for you. Anybody that doesn't know about GenesisCare and Penny Brohn, you're very welcome to this webinar, and there's some information there. Okay, so welcome everybody. We've just got a few more people coming in. As I said, a very, very warm welcome to our webinar jointly hosted by GenesisCare and Penny Brohn UK. My name is Sally Sadiq and I work for Penny Brohn as the partnership lead with GenesisCare. So this session, for those of you that haven't attended one before, lasts for an hour, and we are recording it so that both organisations can use it to further help more people with cancer. And the webinar will appear on the Penny Brohn website homepage. If you scroll to the bottom of that page, you'll find all 4 webinars that we've recorded. We'll be using a short polling questionnaire at the end of the session, as we're keen to know if this session has met your needs and your answers are anonymous. Today's session is the last of a series of webinars on the integrative cancer care, treating the whole person approach, which covers various ways that cancer treatments like surgery, radiotherapy and chemotherapy can be combined with lifestyle and complementary approaches to help reduce side effects and improve outcomes for people affected by cancer. Today's topic is fatigue, and Dr. Catherine Zollman will be posing questions to our panel guests. If you'd like to ask any questions on this topic, please use the Q&A function. I'll be keeping an eye on the questions coming in and raise them with the panel if time allows. We may not get a chance to answer all your questions in the limited time, so please bear with us and note that we're not able to answer any questions that relate to individual circumstances or cases. Please also note that all opinions are the panel's individual opinions and they're not representative of either organisation. So now over to Catherine, and I'll let her introduce the rest of the panellists.
Thank you, Sally, and really a warm welcome on behalf of both Penny Brohn and GenesisCare to this evening webinar. The reason that we've chosen tonight's topic of cancer-related fatigue is because it is a really common issue that many people who use our services tell us they are having trouble managing. I'm delighted this evening to be joined by 3 experts who are going to really help us understand this troublesome problem a little bit more and help us with practical strategies that can really help make a difference. So tonight we've got Hoda Booz with us, who is a consultant clinical oncologist from Bristol. Hoda specialises in treating head and neck and gynecological cancers or women's cancers. I'm also joined by 2 of our Penny Brohn and GenesisCare wellbeing consultants. So these are wellbeing consultants who are based in GenesisCare treatment centres, but they give holistic wellbeing and integrative support to patients who are receiving treatment in those centres. Faye is a wellbeing consultant based in London and Guildford, and she's got a background as an occupational therapist. And Joanne is a wellbeing consultant from Bristol who has a background in nutritional therapy. So I've said that fatigue is really common. Macmillan Cancer Support estimate that between about 75 and 90% of people with a cancer diagnosis will experience fatigue at some point. And this point can be very variable. For some people, it's a symptom that they notice before they're even diagnosed. Sometimes it is immediately after diagnosis that it hits them. Sometimes it's during treatment, and sometimes it's a symptom that persists even after treatment has finished, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months, sometimes rarely even for years. We don't really understand exactly the mechanisms of why cancer-related fatigue is such a common thing. And that does make it difficult to treat it in a systematic scientific way where we address the causes. But what we do know is that research has shown that there are many things that can make a difference to either preventing cancer-related fatigue becoming a significant issue, or if it is established, there are many things that can make a difference that we're going to discuss tonight. I think the final thing before we kind of head over to our panel is to really understand that fatigue is something that's very, very different from the normal tiredness that you can expect after doing something challenging. Fatigue, different people describe it in different ways, but many of the clients and the patients who I see describe it as literally like running out of fuel, or like a battery just having completely run out of charge. It stops them literally in their tracks. There's no way they can kind of push through it or continue with activities. It is actually like there's absolutely nothing left and they've completely run out of energy. And this isn't just to do with physical activity. Often it's energy needed to do things like think clearly, manage emotional situations, manage social situations. So fatigue is much more than just a physical symptom. It does affect every aspect of people's lives. Having said that, and having kind of defined this topic, that it's only when people actually experience fatigue that they tell me that now I really understand what it is. Before it was just a word. And actually, once people experience that particular type of actually energy drain that comes as a result of a cancer diagnosis or treatment, then they understand, and they start to learn how they can manage it. But I think I'd like to turn to Hoda now, because I think it is the sort of thing, fatigue is the sort of thing that often we find isn't really being talked about. And so why do you think it is important to discuss fatigue? As a consultant oncologist, how would you go about approaching the subject of fatigue, Hoda?
Well, I think one of the issues I have actually is that we do discuss it, but I think when we first meet patients and start discussing or explaining the treatment journey that they're going to get, and the side effects, and once we actually start talking about the side effects, the first thing usually, and actually on most of our on leaflets and on our consent forms, is fatigue. Unfortunately, a lot of patients actually, I wouldn't say brush over it, but you know, they're not interested to hear about this. I think most patients would be more concentrating about image or something that is going to affect them physically, or they can even touch it in their life, you know, their daily life. So when you say, you know, fatigue, as you said, they would actually assume you mean they're going to be a bit tired. And that's understandable, that's fine. Am I going to be sick? Am I going to be losing my hair? Am I, you know, is it going to affect me from, you know, it's the things that they will touch, or their image in front of others is what's actually important. So we do discuss it, but I don't think people appreciate, and I'm not going to say everyone, but I can't blame patients for not appreciating it. But a lot actually, the conception of actually what fatigue means, or whether how tiredness is very, it really varies, and almost all would actually just wait until you start talking about the other things that is important to them. On the other hand, when you actually finish treatment, and sort of whether this is radical treatment or palliative treatment, so curative treatment or palliative treatments, whether using radiotherapy or chemotherapy, when you actually see the patients afterwards and things that have settled, which are the things that they were worried about, as in, you know, they no longer have got the diarrhea or the constipation, or they're no longer sick, or, you know, again, the physical things that they have been worried about, the first thing you'd hear is, but actually I'm really worried because I'm still very tired. The fatigue is just, I just can't go back to my normal life. And this is why it's an important subject to actually discuss, and you know, lovely to have the specialists there to actually talk about it, because it's very multifactorial, as you know.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think it is, I think until I started talking to people with cancer, I didn't really appreciate that how different it is just from the normal tiredness. And I think you're absolutely right that unless you kind of explain that if this does happen to you, it's not abnormal, there's nothing to feel guilty about, it's not, you haven't brought it on yourself. I think a lot of people do feel somehow they should be feeling better at the end of treatment, but actually they're not, and they think there's something going wrong, as you say.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, do you think that fatigue and how people experience it varies? So you treat gynecological cancers, but you also treat head and neck cancers. Do you think there's a difference in the way those two groups of patients experience their fatigue, or is it more about
no, I wouldn't say different in terms of because of the site, but you're right, it does vary. And I think the variation is, why are we getting fatigue? So as you appreciate, both with head and neck and with gynecological cancers, they're treated in different ways. You know, we're talking about, you know, loads of treatments. We're talking either about radiotherapy or chemotherapy. You're also, as we know, talking about, are you treating patients curatively, or are you treating them, you know, with a palliative intent? And also, are you using radiotherapy and chemotherapy together? Because in some treatments that you're using both together. So I think it's not the variation between the two sites as much as what is the treatment and what the intention of the treatment was.
Hoda, do you mind just explaining, just in case anybody listening doesn't, you know, the word palliative can mean quite a lot to different people. When you say palliative treatment, what do you mean there? So
with palliation, you're actually giving treatment to make symptoms better. So concentrating more on the quality of life, what is actually troubling patients. So you're at the end of the treatment, you are more likely that you still have disease there, but the patient feels better in themselves, as in the side effect, you know, in terms of if they developed with pain, or if they experience bleeding. You know, with palliative treatment, you're actually treating the main symptom, but the outcome of the treatment is not that your patient is going to be disease-free altogether. And so that's why it's very important to know what that fatigue is coming from. Fatigue can be from cancer itself. So it can be either that the cancer itself that had spread to organs, but also it can be from a cancer that is curable, but pressing on an organ that making you feeling very tired as a patient. And therefore, after the end of the treatment, although you've treated the cancer and the cancer is actually improved in terms of size and not pressing on that organ again, but from what we've used in terms of the chemotherapy or the radiotherapy, the patient can still feel tired. And the description that you said, you know, like a car running out of petrol, or, you know, car running out of energy as a battery, just draining a battery. I mean, this is, for example, typical when, you know, if you're treating, for example, a patient with head and neck cancers, and you're treating both sides of the neck, in the middle of your neck, you've got the thyroid gland. So actually, if on the long run, we always talk to GPs about it and mention it in our letters, that actually checking thyroid functions in the long run is an important thing. It might be fine after finishing treatment when we're still following the patient up, but when the patient finishes treatment altogether and they're actually back in the community and being looked after by the GP, there is a possibility, there is a risk that this thyroid gland is becoming underactive bit by bit. And it's something that, you know, everyone needs to be aware of, the patient and the GP as well.
I think you've highlighted a really important point, which is that although at the beginning I said we don't really understand the mechanism of cancer-related fatigue, it is really important to identify and treat any treatable causes that might be contributing to the fatigue and the tiredness. And I will come back to that later about, don't just assume it's cancer-related fatigue, therefore you just have to get on and manage it. It may be really important to have certain tests, like, as Hoda said, if you've had any kind of radiotherapy to the neck area, having your thyroid function monitored, like if you've had some chemotherapy, checking that you're not depleted in any minerals, important minerals, or that you're not deficient in any vitamins. So we'll come on to that, but that's really helpful to see just how common it is and just how difficult it is an issue to kind of address preventatively in a way, but how important it can be to
and one of the things that I'd like to highlight also, that because there are so many causes that can cause it, the management for it is really multidisciplinary. So it's not one person that's going to manage it. And the important thing, there isn't a magic pill that's going to treat it. So one of the things I'd like all our patients to be, you know, cautious of, do not shop online for anti-fatigue treatments, because, you know, multivitamins, which are actually magic bullets, which I would call, they're actually really harmful, because you're talking about concentrated vitamins that patients are taking, which it might not be the reason why you're fatigued. So I think one of the things that need to be really addressed very cautiously, and patients not just stop trying to manage themselves with it, if you like.
Absolutely. But there are some really helpful strategies. So Faye, I'd like to turn to you now and just say, as a wellbeing consultant, assume that somebody's had all the relevant tests and that there isn't anything that needs immediate treatment as a cause of their fatigue. If somebody just came to you, after they completed their treatment or during treatment, just saying they're having real problems with managing their troublesome fatigue, how might you approach it, or how might you start the conversation? Oh, Faye.
Sorry, I was on mute. So I'd say I always start by getting an understanding of what fatigue means to the person that I'm speaking with. How is it showing up in their life, and how is it impacting on their daily activities that they need and want to do? And I think this is really important, because we know that fatigue is such a subjective experience, and we know that it particularly becomes an issue for people when it starts to impact on their daily function. And then I think there's also things that we know about fatigue that can help people to start to identify things that might start to help them. So I just highlight these for them. So one of them is the fact that causes are multifactorial. So I always encourage them to maintain that dialogue with their medical team so that they're not alone with it. Also, that energy is needed for all types of activity. So physical, emotional, cognitive, and social. So I think lots of people understand physicals and why that, and when they're feeling tired, because physically they may have overdone it. But I think often frustration can set in for people when they're exhausted, but they feel like they've not actually been able to do anything physically. And it might actually be that they're feeling fatigued because of cognitive or emotional energy expenditure. And instead they may perhaps need to be focusing on managing their emotions or managing their mental energy. And then another aspect that I do highlight to people is that fatigue doesn't always get better with sleep and rest. These things may help for a period of time, a short amount of time, but it doesn't make it go away. And in fact, our bodies need activity in order to produce energy. So it's a fine balance, because you don't want to be overdoing it, because then I think you run the risk of running into the boom and bust cycle. And I think with such variable energy levels, there is always that temptation once you start something to keep going until you just can't do any more. But that really isn't an efficient use of your energy, I'd say. And what you're looking for actually is to find a balance and stay within your limits.
That's really helpful, and helpful to kind of frame it like that. So if we haven't got loads of time tonight, but I know that you would have a long detailed conversation, as you say, really tailoring your approach to the individual circumstances. But if you had to pick two key areas, say when you first start to talk to somebody, what might be, where would you start?
Well, I mean, as Hoda mentioned, there is no silver bullet solution to fatigue. I think it's really easy to overestimate the importance of one defining moment and underestimate the value of making better decisions on a daily basis. Because really it does come down to making small changes that can be made across a whole person's life. So one area I do often focus on is that of energy management strategies, because these can help someone identify how to stay within their own energy envelope and not push beyond their limits. And so often a good place to start here is for people to develop an awareness of kind of their current energy levels and understand how different activities need different levels of energy. So some activities will drain your battery and others will recharge and replenish you. And these will be different for each person. I'd say all activities do use energy, but you need to find the ones that give you a boost. And those can be things like, just as an example, spending time in nature, doing activities that give you a sense of mastery or achievement, or doing activities that bring on a sense of deep rest, like relaxation and mindfulness. And a good way to track this is, I often do recommend to people if it's really severe for them, or they're just starting out on trying to figure out how they can maybe improve, is keeping a fatigue diary. And there's examples of these online. Macmillan have quite a good one, in Prostate Cancer UK, just to name a couple. But And I also recommend that if they can, to enlist the support of someone that's close to them. So because that not only helps them manage their own energy levels, but it can also give those around them an insight into what is helpful and what isn't. And then once they're armed with this information, they then can go about trying to develop new ways of doing things. So, and I often structure this around the 5 Ps, which I'll just go through very briefly. But the first P is prioritizing and just letting go of those things that you can't do at this time. The second P is planning. So you create a better balance of your activities and don't group high energy activities together. The third one is pacing yourself. So that's breaking down an activity into a more manageable chunks, taking regular breaks and stopping before you get tired. The fourth one is just considering your position and making the most of your own body mechanics. And these can be really simple things like sitting down uses less energy, or working with your arms in between like waist and shoulder height and not up high. And then the final one, and this often is quite important for people, is permission. And that is permission to ease back on the expectations you place on yourself, because expectations they paint a mental picture of how you think things should be. And the language, I should be doing this, just reinforces the negative. It reinforces what you're not doing. And that leads to emotions such as guilt, frustration, anxiety, which are all really energy sapping emotions. And it might be that reframing fatigue to see it as a protective mechanism that's allowing your body to recover at this time can be helpful. And then I'd say another area that I often focus on is that of exercise and movement. And that is because exercise does have the most amount of evidence behind it in terms of its effectiveness in helping with fatigue. So what we do know is that mild to moderate exercise has been shown that it may improve a person's energy levels. And whilst there's no exact exercise prescription, because each person is different, they've got different cancers, they've different reactions to treatments, there is a general kind of recommendation to aim for 150 minutes of mild to moderate exercise a week. Although if someone is experiencing severe fatigue, this would have to be modified and it would have to be worked up to gradually under the guidance of their medical team. And also if anyone's starting a new activity or looking to increase their exercise levels, then I always recommend speaking with their medical team to find out the best way to do it and the safest way to do it, really. And just a few other points I make to people about exercise is that to start small, set your goal, set your aim quite small, and set upper limits too, so you don't overdo it, because you do not want to be going into that boom and bust cycle. You're aiming for consistency. I also talk about how, it doesn't have to be about traditional exercise. It can be about finding those things that you can put into your daily routine, like walking to and from the shops, doing some movement between advert breaks or between chapters of a book. And also gardening, housework, they are really physical workouts. And I think when people are reflecting back on what they've done, it's quite easy to forget things like that. And people are often focused on what they haven't been able to do. And actually when they sit down and talk through what they have done, they realize that they are doing more than they realize. And I'm just going to end on this, is that when I talk about exercise, is also it really helps to find something you enjoy doing, because you're more likely to stick at it. And we also know that enjoyable activities energize you.
Thanks, Faye. I think that's a brilliant overview of some of the things that can make a difference there. And I think, again, I'm so glad you highlighted exercise, because often it's a bit counterintuitive. And again, I think it comes back to this confusion between tiredness and exercise. And tiredness, you think, well, I'll rest. But actually fatigue is a bit different, and the evidence strongly points to the fact that actually too much rest can make fatigue worse, and that there's, this is now repeated, as Faye says, the evidence is really quite strong that actually going into treatment with a regular exercise or activity sort of plan actually can help prevent it. And I think as doctors, we may need to take some responsibility for actually probably over protecting people and telling them to, I think this is now quite an old-fashioned view, but certainly, back when I was a medical student, people were told, you're going to be going through a really tough time, just take as much rest as you need, really rest up, almost put yourself to bed. And we know that that's absolutely the wrong advice to be giving to people. And so we have to kind of change people's mindsets that thinks, when I'm tired, I need to rest. Yes, you do, but you also need activity. So thanks very much. Is that any further comments on that, Faye? Or?
No,
nothing.
Sorry, Sally, interrupting. We just had a question to say, what was the 4th P again? So you were doing your 4 Ps or 5 Ps.
The 4th one was considering your
was it your position? Your
position. So your own body mechanics.
Oh,
so,
fantastic. Thank you.
Yes, because often we don't realise how much energy we're using up doing something like standing or sitting, sitting down or standing up in a way that actually isn't using our body ergodynamically, which is kind of in the way it's most efficiently used.
Yeah, and things like bending, twisting, pushing, pulling, they all use up more energy. So just thinking about what muscle groups you're using to, say, carry a bag. If it's in your hands, your muscle groups aren't as strong as like if you have a backpack and put it on your back. So just, things like that.
Brilliant. So we've talked a lot about movement. One of the other things that I think people don't realise quite how much of an impact it might have on energy levels is what they eat and how they eat. So Joanne, as a trained nutritional therapist and a Penny Brohn wellbeing consultant, how do you help people think about the impact that the food and the drink that they're having might be having on their energy levels?
Well, there's 2 aspects to consider when it comes to eating and fatigue. There's both what you eat and also how you eat. And under how, that would include sort of food preparation and planning, and also the timing of when you eat. As a nutritional therapist, I would help people to explore their individual needs. There's no one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to dietary recommendations. It very much depends on what your goals are. So whether you're trying to maintain weight, lose weight, gain weight, whether there's foods that you dislike, foods that you can't tolerate, foods that you don't eat for cultural or ethical reasons. And also considerations such as whether you're cooking for yourself or whether you're cooking to fit in with the rest of the family. So yeah, there's 2 different aspects to look at there.
Yes, no, that's a really, really, really important thing to differentiate those kind of what you eat and how you eat. So what sort of things about how people eat might make a difference to their energy levels?
So if you consider timing, missing meals or having long gaps between food could make a difference to your energy levels. So ideally, eating sort of at regular intervals, perhaps every 4 to 5 hours, can help. Also, not eating too late, sort of close to bedtime. So having a gap between eating of 2 or 3 hours, because sometimes that could cause sleep disruption. And ideally, sort of having an overnight fast of at least 12 hours. So that would be between having dinner in the evening and having breakfast the next morning. It's been found to be helpful. Sometimes when people suffer fatigue, if they can identify when their energy levels are better, so if you're perhaps feeling better in the morning, eating a more substantial breakfast and lunch and then eating lighter in the afternoon can help also. In terms of, sort of energy spent preparing food and planning food, I would definitely say that if you have any kind offers of support from family or friends, having some home cooked meals that you can perhaps put in your freezer would be a welcome invitation. If you have times where your energy fluctuates and you're feeling more able to prepare food yourself, sort of being able to batch cook food, so cooking, double the amount, splitting it into portions and then putting it in the freezer for the times when you're really struggling with energy can help, because obviously it's easier to just warm something than it is to cook from scratch. Getting back to what Faye was saying, even sitting down to prepare the vegetables can be easier than standing up for a long time, trying to cook to conserve some energy. And there's also some companies out there that will do some decent whole food type meals that, are ready prepared that you can order or you can buy, from somewhere like Cook on the high street and perhaps keep a few in the freezer. So there's some different options that can make it a little bit easier when you're really struggling for energy.
Brilliant. And we have on the Penny Brohn website got a booklet prepared with some oncology oncology dietitians around some of these factors around eating when things get difficult. So if people are wanting to find out a bit more about some of these sort of tips and practical things, there's much more on the website. Joanne, I was going to ask you next about what we eat and the things that we eat, but actually there's a question in the Q&A that says, can your fluid intake affect your energy levels? So maybe we should go to that first and say, what about the effects of what we drink? How does that affect our energy levels?
Yeah, it was one aspect I was going to cover. Staying well hydrated can help with energy. Drinking, sort of throughout the day rather than drinking copious amounts of fluid at meal times is, more advisable. But when you make sort of choices of drinks, I would say to sort of avoid stimulants. So, caffeinated drinks, which could be coffee, tea, hot chocolate, cola, energy drinks, can sometimes have a reverse effect on energy. So in the short term, they tend to give you sort of high sugar, and then your pancreas has to work hard, to bring it back down to normal. And sometimes it goes a little bit low then, and you get a bit of a dip with your sugar level and an energy slump. And to that point, you may crave, sort of something sweet to eat or another caffeinated drink. So, ideally, if you're hoping for a hot drink, I'd say, sort of herbal teas would perhaps be better. Or a cold drink, perhaps flavouring some water with some cucumber or some pieces of fruit to make it more palatable would be better than relying on caffeine. Some people are not that sensitive to caffeine, and they can have a coffee or a cup of tea in the morning and enjoy it, and it doesn't cause sleep disruption. Some of us are much more sensitive, and even a small amount will cause sleep disruption. From my understanding, I believe it comes down to genetic differences perhaps. So, it's something that we can't really control, but if you know that you're sensitive to it and your sleep's disrupted, perhaps it's, one thing to consider trying to swap some non-caffeinated drinks for some other drinks.
Absolutely. And I think if you are struggling to kind of make sense of it, I think the sort of diary that Faye talked about, which looks at activities, you can kind of mirror that with also looking at what you're eating and when you're eating. And sometimes patterns do emerge, don't they? And things that you didn't realize, I always feel more tired if I've, had, an alcoholic drink the night before, or eating a big breakfast rather than a big dinner, or whatever it is. What about then, let's come to what we eat then, and what might be some of the principles about how that might influence energy levels. And Joanne, there's one question around thinking about particularly people with celiac disease, and you were mentioning that there might be some opportunities to buy in ready-made meals, but are you aware of anybody that caters for celiac disease, and might you say something about how people with celiac disease particularly might help manage their energy levels using food?
So I'll start in general terms, in terms of things that can affect energy levels. What we eat can affect our blood sugar balance. Our bodies have to work really hard to regulate our blood sugar. And there's a narrow range where we function at our best. And if our intake of foods contain too many sugars or carbohydrates, and sort of the kind of foods that are described as empty calories or beige foods, so perhaps the white varieties of things like rice and pasta and bread, sweet treats, confectionery, energy drinks, those kind of things, and there's not enough food containing fiber or sort of healthy fats and either plant-based proteins or lean proteins in things like meat and fish, beans and pulses. If we don't have the balance of the combination of foods, that can affect our blood sugar, because if we're having, sort of too many simple sugars and we're getting high blood sugar followed by dip, that'll definitely, affect our ability to sustain our energy. Going back to what Catherine was saying earlier, if you look in the Penny Brohn Healthy Eating Guidelines on the website, there's suggestions of what kind of foods contain protein, carbohydrates and fats, and there's this lovely healthy plate diagram that gives you some examples of what fits into the categories and what proportions of those foods to eat. And it's probably easier to make sense of it, looking at the diagram than it is just listening, to me speak. in terms of if you've got celiac disease, you know, that can make it a little bit more difficult because some of the restrictions that you have upon your diet. However, I would say there's foods that fit those categories that don't actually contain any gluten. So, you know, you can have a diet that's rich in plant-based foods. You can still have some lean protein or some plant-based protein and some healthy fats. So you can still eat with the same principles, but just avoiding the foods that contain the gluten. So you don't actually have to eat foods that they would have in the gluten-free section of a supermarket that can sometimes be quite highly processed and not particularly high in nutritional value. The only thing that you're guaranteed is that they don't contain gluten. However, there's, you know, things such as, you know, like porridge oats or quinoa or whatever, they're gluten-free anyway. So there's lots of, you know, vegetables and fruit and things that we can eat that if you've got celiac disease, you could still eat. So it does make it a little bit more complicated, but not, you know, sort of something that's not possible.
And I think there was a question around ready, you know, if your energy levels are low and you want to buy in pre-prepared, good quality food, are there any particular companies that you'd recommend for?
I don't know whether there's any that specifically say that they're gluten-free, but then I think if you look at sort of, I'm familiar with Cook, which is one that does food that's cooked by a chef and then frozen, and you can get the nutritional content of the food on the packaging, and you can see it online. So you can see exactly, you know, how much protein, fat and carbohydrates it has, and it will tell you if it's gluten-free on it, so you can see the ingredients. So I guess if you're choosing, you know, sort of a fish and some kind of gluten-free grain and some vegetables, then if you know, look for the symbols on the information, you'll be able to choose accordingly.
Lovely, so. Thank you. So I guess what you're saying is that fatigue really can be quite significantly affected by our eating and our drinking patterns, which I guess, again, that makes a lot of sense. And sometimes it's a bit counterintuitive, because sometimes what you're saying is something that has a label saying energy drink, which you'd think, great, I'm fatigued, I'll have an energy drink. But you're actually saying that might actually end up you crashing a little bit later and actually contributing to the problem. And I suppose, again, coming back to my analogy with the car and the fuel, I guess we wouldn't really expect our cars to run well if we're not putting the right fuel, the right oil in, and we're not putting the right amount of water in, and we're not servicing it at the right time. So why should we expect our bodies to be any different? So really understanding that, especially when energy is low, you really do need to be putting good quality ingredients in and making sure that you're doing it at the right time. But I think you've covered an awful lot, Jan, and I think there's a lot of information to take in, and it can sometimes get quite confusing. Are there any, have you got any suggestions about where people could go to find out a bit more information if they're realizing that maybe food and drink is something that they want to look at?
In addition to the healthy eating guidelines that I was talking about, you know, Penny Brohn UK actually does a Eating Well with Cancer online talk, usually on the first afternoon, Tuesday afternoon of each month. And this is a really good place to start if this is all new to you. And then there's these lovely focused nutrition know-how sessions that happen on Wednesday mornings. And they're usually sort of more specific in terms of, it could be, you know, eating to balance your blood sugar or eating to support your immune health. And those sessions include, you know, sort of suggestions of foods that you can swap, and how to prepare food, and, you know, meal ideas. So, you know, there's lots of online support available from Penny Brohn. As Catherine mentioned earlier, you know, there's the books that have been written in conjunction with the oncology dietitians and Penny Brohn. There's one about eating well, and there's also the one if you've got any side effects of treatment that helps, you know, with your nutrition and coping with those side effects. If you've got more complex nutrition needs and you need sort of individualized advice, I'd say, you know, having read the guidelines from Penny Brohn and maybe attended some of the online Zoom webinars, you can contact Penny Brohn and organise a one-to-one telephone consultation with one of the experienced nutritional therapists based there. So, you know, that's a really good offering, and that's a great way to get some individualised support.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And just to, if people aren't aware, Penny Brohn is a charity, and we offer all these services. Many of the services that Joanne was talking about are offered via a Zoom platform, a little bit like this, but as a meeting, so you'd be able to see other people there if you wanted to. And they're all offered without any fees. We encourage donations if people can afford to make a donation to help us cover the cost of our services, but nobody is excluded on the basis of inability to pay. So it's everything is kind of, you can book it through our website, and all those sessions that Joanne mentioned are available to anybody affected by cancer. So I can see there's quite a lot of questions coming up. We've covered how activity levels, how keeping a sort of diary of our energy draining activities and our energy supporting activities can make a difference. We've covered how food can make a difference. And I think what I want to do at this point is just highlight some of the other really important strategies that can make a difference. And I'm going to go through them very quickly, but if any of them do sort of spark a sort of thought, it's worth discussing this with your GP, with your wellbeing consultant if you're at GenesisCare, or coming and discussing them with us at Penny Brohn, or going back to your oncology teams as well. I think often people are very, in the UK, we have a major problem with vitamin D deficiency. A lot of people are under the recommended dose of blood levels of vitamin D, simply because the sun doesn't shine enough in England for most of us to get adequate levels in our skin. Also, obviously, if you're having cancer treatment, they often tell you to stay out of the sun, so that might compound a problem. So definitely getting your vitamin D levels and making sure that you are in the optimum range, not just in the sort of suboptimal, could be a bit better, but not terribly deficient. You really want to be at the top end or a little bit above the upper limit of what the NHS says is normal. And evidence is changing, but I think the recommendations for how much vitamin D we really should have are moving upwards a little bit. So definitely, if you are feeling fatigued, I would definitely get your vitamin D levels checked and optimized. Simple to take supplements, which you can buy over the counter, and as long as you're having your levels measured, they won't interact with any of your other medication. They are just replacing something that should normally be there. Really important to think about mind-body therapies, and I think Faye has already talked about how exhausting stress and tension and anxiety are, and so anything that can help you with worries, help you calm the mind, help you relax the body can be really useful. Through Penny Brohn, we've got access to 2 fantastic apps that can be really helpful: Headspace and Daylight, which Headspace is a mindfulness training one. Daylight is an app that helps deal with worry and anxiety, but also seeing a counsellor or a psychological therapist or a psychologist, or addressing those things if you're aware that is an issue for you. We've hinted, and Hoda has spoken about the many other sorts of factors that can exacerbate tiredness. So if you've got troublesome symptoms like pain, if you're experiencing hormonal symptoms like night sweats, which are waking you up in the night, or bladder problems, which are waking you up in the night to go to the toilet, or digestive problems, which mean you're not absorbing your food well enough, you absolutely need to sort of attend to those background troublesome symptoms to optimize your chances of good energy levels. So don't ignore those, and don't sort of feel, well, it's just something I need to put up with. Complementary therapies of various kinds have been shown to really help with fatigue. So things like acupuncture, body work, other restorative body therapies like reflexology, massage, Reiki, shiatsu, those sorts of things can be deeply relaxing, but also sometimes patients describe to me that is a bit like being a phone plugged into a charger, suddenly feeling a bit more energized as a result of having those treatments. And although the evidence isn't strong, it is something that's generally very safe if done in the hands of somebody who's experienced at working alongside cancer treatments and working in this field. And so I would encourage people to just give it a go and see what works for you, if it works for you. And we mentioned those kind of gentle restorative types of activity, things particularly like Qigong or Tai Chi or restorative yoga, gentle activities which can actually be very energizing, are a great place to start. And there are a number of herbal supplements that you need to be careful with if you're on treatment or on any other kind of medication. Get a pharmacist or get your doctor to check any potential interactions. But there are things that can support, often they're called adaptogenic herbal medicines. And you might have heard of things like ginseng or rhodiola or ashwagandha. Those can be useful, sometimes in small amounts, and there are herbal teas that contain a little bit of these sorts of things that wouldn't be enough to cause problems with medication if you're just having them fairly intermittently. But if you were going to take a concentrated supplement, I would always encourage you to do it with the knowledge and the approval of your medical team. And we talked again about just sort of doing things that you'd consider recharging activities, really, really thinking in your life, what are the things that bring me joy and that actually give me that sense of being recharged, and making sure that life isn't all about cancer, but that there's plenty of time for some of those recharging activities. So that's a lot to take in, and obviously nobody is going to do all of these things, but really what we wanted to do was highlight the fact that people don't need to feel kind of helpless and hopeless if they are experiencing fatigue. There are many things that can make a positive difference to how you manage it going forwards, but it's a question of finding the right things for you. And I love the idea of getting support from your friends, from your family. Often they can see clearer than we can when we're in the middle of it, the things that are working for us. And start slowly, and you really don't need to try and do it all at once. So let's have a quick look. I didn't mention sleep hygiene and how, but there is one question about sleep disruption. And I think sleep is a whole other topic. And we have at Penny Brohn, we have done webinars on sleep, and we may well do them again, because integrative approaches to sleep management make such a difference. But I think any kind of disruption to your sleep, whether it's the amount of sleep or the quality of sleep, and whether it's waking up frequently or not being able to get to sleep, but remember that there isn't one right amount of sleep or right pattern of sleep. It is normal to wake up in the night. It's and have periods of lighter sleep, but there are many factors that can make a difference to how well we sleep. And there's some brilliant books around about this, but I would really recommend another app that Penny Brohn can give people free access to. Is called Sleepio, and it's one of the best researched sleep programs that's done as an interactive online thing with a community of other people who are also supporting you, and it takes you really through all the different factors that can make a difference. So sleep hygiene and your sleep expectations are a really big part of that. So let's have a look at questions. Faye, I think this is one for you, maybe around, I cannot tell when I'm going to run out of energy. It's very hard to work within my limits when they seem to shift every day. Any suggestions?
Yeah, I think that is really tricky. I'd probably say stopping for regular breaks and checking in with your body, because often our bodies will be giving us early signals that we're starting to get tired. But if we're in the middle of doing an activity and not paying attention to our bodies, we can often miss them. So for example, sometimes before we get physically tired, it might be that mentally you become a bit more fatigued. So if, for example, you're really good at doing the crosswords and you're trying to do it and actually it's taking you a lot longer, or you can't just focus as well, that actually might be quite a strong signal to you that you should be stopping now. So I would say just again, perhaps using a bit of a diary, or if that's not for you, like just tracking it somehow, but just starting to really get to know your body and what signals it might be telling you.
I think that's so important, and also getting to know your new body, because I think a body that's had cancer treatment, you can't assume that what you could do before is, and even what were energy giving things before, they might have now switched to be energy draining things. So I think what Faye's saying is really sensible. Question for you, Joanne, really about what about if diarrhea is one of the other side effects, which limits the foods that you can eat for energy? Any comments on that?
I think it perhaps depends on the reason why you have diarrhea. Obviously, if you're actively on treatment or it's a side effect of treatment, in the short term, I'd always suggest to patients, undergoing treatment, to follow the advice by their clinical team and eat the low residue diet, because it may just be a short-term thing that, sort of following the correct diet, that it will help to manage the situation And once, the symptoms have subsided a bit, that you'll be able to then start to reintroduce some of the more nutrient-dense foods that perhaps you're eating prior to having treatment. So, I think it's perhaps working out what you can tolerate as well. So there may be certain foods that are, sort of vegetables that you can eat that are less fibrous, and certain things that trigger a reaction. And as Catherine was saying earlier, sometimes it's a case of keeping a diary and trying to reintroduce one food and eating it a couple of days and seeing whether your symptoms are okay. And if you can tolerate it, you can then add it to your list with, a tick beside it. And if it causes a reaction, that perhaps you just put that one on hold for a bit, and then when your symptoms are subsided, you then try another new food. So it can be a bit tedious, but it's a bit of trial and error sometimes to gradually reintroduce foods.
Quite a lot of detective work. And Hoda may want to say something a bit more about diarrhea.
Yeah. And actually, it's a very interesting question that is, because as you know, because I do gynecological cancers, and I would giving radiotherapy to the pelvis definitely triggers diarrhea. And one of the things I want to put in there is the psychology and the anxiety about the side effects that we know that they're hopefully temporary. So if someone asks that question, it's usually, and not always, but usually patients that are on treatment and really want to make sure that they're having the optimum food. And it's just the natural feeling that you want to know that you're doing the best for yourself. And it needs patience. It's just, when you've got diarrhea, because it's secondary to, if this was the case, that it was secondary to treatment whilst you're on radiotherapy, it's the time to pause and actually lower down the fiber intake, as you suggested, but also opt the hydration. So there's still something else that you can do. If you increase the hydration and don't worry about the food that you really wanted to have, that will actually help with the energy levels, massively help with the energy levels. I think from what I take from all the advice that we're getting, we need the balance. You always need the balance when you're actually managing fatigue. Because fatigue is multifactorial, then also it needs so many things together. The easiest thing in my feeling, I'm not a specialist as you are in managing fatigue, but my feeling is always go back to nature. So if you're actually, you're wanting to, increase your energy levels, then actually walking outside, you're exposed to the sun. If it was sunny, you're exposed to fresh air, and you're actually moving, so you're getting some exercise. When you're thinking about diet, there are simple things that if you always have them in your fridge, like milk, eggs, pulses, having the fruits and vegetables, mix them wherever you want. If you want to have them raw, you want to cook them, you want, increase the hydration and have, these are the natural things. And the fruit will never give you that high sugar levels. It's always the natural, if things are coming from nature, they're always balanced. So it's not like a bar of chocolates. If you're actually having an apple, it's still sweet and it's still going to give you that energy, but it's taking it bit by bit and building up and balancing everything together.
Absolutely. And remember that to balance your blood sugar, you don't always need fiber. Just having fat and protein alongside some of the more sort of energy dense kind of carbohydrates, that can smooth out the ups and downs of the blood sugar that Joanne was talking about. Just quickly, because I'm aware we're running out of time, a little question around and coming back to Hoda's point, which I think is so important, is that what I love about the whole person approach that we talk about at Penny Brohn and this integrative model is that even if one thing is a bit difficult for you right at the moment, just like Hoda was saying, if you've got diarrhea, then really focusing on a kind of high plant density diet may not be the most appropriate thing right now, but there are plenty of things you can do. Just like she was saying, you going out in nature, you can do the mind body, the relaxing side of things, you can have acupuncture, you can have other complementary therapies, there's lots you can do. And so there's almost never a situation where there's nothing you can do. There's a question about overnight fasting, and I don't know, just very quickly, I think the science shows that although it's quite good to manage our energy levels during the day with small amounts to eat, actually our bodies do need a period when we're not eating for our optimum sort of housekeeping function. It's a little bit like, you know, giving the body time to be doing the repair and the maintenance work rather than the digesting work. And there are various basic science sort of studies which show that actually the programmed cell death, which helps us to get rid of abnormal cells, works better if we have that longer overnight fast. But again, really interesting work and emerging science around this. So it's another very interesting topic in itself. Let's have any questions. So is there anywhere that Macmillan do have a very useful booklet on cancer-related fatigue? If somebody was saying, how can I help people? Oh, Faye's already typing the answer to that one. That's great. And a final question that I think is here, that I think we've managed to answer everything else actually, is around people who are on their own most of the time. And I think that is a really interesting and often quite tricky situation. And I think mobilizing whatever circles of support you have, even if, I think Joanne's given you some helpful tips around, maybe even if you have a bit of help from time to time, could you maximize that help by getting somebody to, you know, load up your freezer, or to do some of the tricky energy draining tasks that might you know, do a bit of work in the garden, if that's something that's preying on your mind. I do think using technology to kind of connect you with other people can be very helpful. It depends again whether you're able to access therapies and things like that. If you are able to kind of get some hands-on therapies there, many of the complementary therapists who stopped working in lockdown are now back working in COVID-safe settings, and that can be fantastic. I think receiving at this time, whether you have to pay to receive it and kind of organize sort of things like a massage or things like that from a professional, or whether you can actually put the net out and just ask for support. Sometimes just support over the phone can be fantastic, and support and just reducing that social isolation, because I think isolation and loneliness can also be quite exhausting too. I don't know, does anybody else have any other thoughts?
I do actually, because I know that our specialist nurses, in fact, can you know, if usually at all cancer sites there is a specialist, you'll find that there is a specialist nurse. So even if you're someone who's finished treatment but still have the contact details of the specialist nurse, it's worth giving them a ring, because at the moment we've got also the Macmillan support workers, which they can actually put you through any gatherings or things that are quite close to you in your area, you know, sometimes they offer one-to-one, and you know, someone that can weekly come in and actually have just that little chat, or suggest things that are in the area. And lots of my patients actually found it really helpful.
And on that point, all GPs now across the country do have access to what's called social prescribing. So they'll have a social prescribing link worker who can put you in touch with other activities and other volunteers in your local community who can provide that practical support. So definitely worth getting in touch and asking your GP to sort of be put in touch with the social prescribing link workers, who can offer sometimes very practical support and also put you in touch. And again, you know, I think our Penny Brohn is trying to bring communities together. So at least if you're not physically able to be with somebody, then being able to talk to them online or in a Zoom meeting would be helpful. So Sally, I'm aware that you're probably going to be telling us that we need to finish now.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so thank you. Before everybody goes there, Catherine, if we could just launch the poll.
Absolutely. I was just going to say we've got a very quick poll that it would be really helpful if people who are on the webinar could just complete very quickly. It's an anonymous poll, so it will really help us with developing our services and knowing what's the kind of topics that would be really useful to cover going forwards. So thank you very much for completing that poll for us. Just a final, Sally, did you want to say anything while people are?
Yeah, I'm just checking. Is that poll actually launched?
I can see it, but it says host and panelists can't vote. But you have put it up there, but I'm not sure.
Nina, could you assist?
Yeah, people are saying that they can vote.
They can vote. Oh, brilliant. Excellent. So yes. So thank you so much for your attendance at this webinar, and for those who've posed such thought-provoking questions. We're actually having a break of the webinars over the summer because we want to review and evaluate these sessions, and that's why we've got a few extra questions for the polls, really for us to understand, has it met your needs? Is this something you'd be interested if we change the format to a podcast? All those kind of things. And finally, you know, Penny Brohn UK is a charity. So if you feel that this webinar has been helpful for you and you're able to donate, please do so, because that obviously will help us to continue to support cancer patients. And I will pop a slide up just right at the end if you're interested in accessing that. But I think still voting at the moment. So yes.
Brilliant. And I think there's only one other question in the Q&A that I've noticed around the sort of exhaustingness of hospital appointments and rearrangements and having to chase things. So absolutely, I think if you can appoint somebody to be your admin, you know, a friend or a colleague to help you negotiate all of that, absolutely. This is a time to reach out and ask for support with some of those tricksy things. It is just, administration and bureaucratic things are very exhausting. So I would completely echo that.
Fantastic, thank you. So yeah, thank you so much for everybody that's voting at the moment. It really will make a difference. It is anonymous, but we will take real notice of what you're saying. And as soon as you voted, if you want to and to leave us, we wish you well for the rest of your evening.
Yes, have a wonderful evening, and thank you for joining us, and thank you for being posing such sensible and really helpful questions, because I think that you've touched on some really important points there.
Fantastic, thank you all very much. Just wait for the last 100%. That's fantastic. So we can end the polling, and